All right, it's 10 o'clock, or pretty close to. Are there any questions before we start today's lecture? All right, if there is no questions, then we'll start today's lecture. Today's discussion will focus on chapter 12. Probably, if you had to ask me what my favorite chapter was in the book, it's probably this one. And for students, it's probably the one you should pay most attention to. It's the one that's going to decide kind of the future of your lives. This is what you should be worried about if you had to come through economics. What should I be worried about? What should I care about as a student? Well, as a student, you should have a long-term view of where you want to be in 20, 30, 40 years. I know it sounds like a long time, but it is. So the question is you want an economy in a country that is going to grow and expand in that time. And so you should care about what are the mechanisms needed for growth. So you should be focused with a whole lot longer term view of the world than, say, someone like your grandparents who may not have that longer view to look at. So what we're going to talk then about is production and growth. Why do countries grow? How do I become rich? Things that we find questions to, especially about what we want in our lives. So I went to this conference, it's now almost 10 years ago, and it was presented by this MIT professor. I believe he's now at Harvard. So if you look down at the bottom of the slides, I do give him credit. They're his slides, and he let everyone in the session have them. And so what he is talking about is he's talking about what drew him to economic growth and development. It would be a similar story for myself as well. So why do we look at economic growth and development? And what he says is start at the very beginning. You look at the world, and you look at the United States and Western Europe, and go to Australia, and a little bit of Canada. And you notice that people in these countries are 40 times as rich as the poorest countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. So that kind of doesn't feel, I said, here in the United States, we may feel like we're poor, but the difference between the average US citizen and the average sub-Saharan African, the Caribbean, the Asian is 40 times. The difference is 40 times. The GDP per capita in the United States is 85,000. That would mean the average person in these places, the average GDP is right around 1,200. Those are huge disparities. And these don't come about overnight. These are due to different growth patterns over the last 2 centuries, 3 centuries. These aren't overnight phenomena. So here's the map of the world in 2012. If we did it today, not much difference. There'd be some richer countries, and you still have the same poor countries. The numbers would just change a little bit, but the colors would be the same. And what you notice is the north part of North America, western part of Europe, and Australia and Japan hanging out over there are all green. They're all the rich countries. You notice the middle of Africa, Southeast Asia, and some of South America. And if you looked in there, the Caribbean, they're all orange or red. They're all the poorest places in the world. And a better way to sometimes do it is just to look at the numbers. Here's what the GDP per capita is. So this is allowing us to compare where GDP per capita is for different countries in the world. I'll probably update these slides sometime, but I just like using his because they're nice and pretty. So look at that. You look at the right tail, very few countries. Look at $5,000 to $10,000 GDP per capita. That means the average citizen in, say, Egypt, Indonesia, Colombia, the average citizen makes somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year. The average citizen in India makes even less. You go to Haiti, you're below $2,000 GDP per capita. And what that purchasing power parity does is it kind of adjusts for other things to give you the same kind of standard of living. So if you had $2,000 in the United States and you had $2,000 in Haiti, that would be the same. You would live in the same kind of accommodations. So sometimes it's hard to think about, is that if you really look at it, half the world subsists, the average person subsists on less than $10,000 a year. So that would be like a citizen of the United States only making $10,000 a year. Think about the accommodations you would have or not have. Think about how your life would be. And he notices this isn't a true statement forever. It doesn't have to be true. So what he does is he shows this graph here. He goes back 1,000 years. So he goes, okay, what was happening 1,000 years ago? How did the world look? And what happened? And if you noticed, Asia used to be at the top of the world. If you've taken world history, that should not be a surprise. But there were lots of great empires, kingdoms, dynasties, countries in Asia right around 1000 AD. That's where the richest places in the world was. However, Asia didn't change a whole lot for almost 900 years. It maintained almost a flat descension. Western Europe grew significantly. If you've taken history, you understand it's a lot of the Industrial Revolution. So where's America in this? We're in the Western offshoots, that little red line. If you go back to 1000 AD, where were we? This land was at the very, very bottom of the world. Poorest place in the world in 1000 AD is you're living in it. And what's happened over time is we've grown to the top, surpassed Western Europe. Latin America grew in the 1600s, kind of flattened out in the 1800s, and then peaked back up in the 1900s. Africa has been kind of trudging along, peaked up a little bit in the 1800s, and then it's kind of flattened out recently. So you can kind of look at this graph to see how different places experienced growth and what kind of growth they experienced. So this chapter is we're going to look at answers to questions. What are kind of some of the facts about standard of living and growth rates? Why does productivity matter? Who cares? How do I know how to become rich? Or how do I become better off as a society, as a person, as a state, as a country, as a company? It doesn't matter. It's productivity. So we're going to talk about how productivity affects living standards, and then what determines productivity, how fast we grow. And then finally, how can the government affect growth and living standards? What can they do to improve standard of living? So what I did is I took the copies from the book. And I didn't pick the United States. I took the United Kingdom because that's what the book had. And I took some pictures from the book about what the average family has in these countries. But what does the average family look like? So here's a picture from the United Kingdom. Okay, here's what the average UK family looks like. They call it a typical one. 2 children, parents, washer, dryer, microwave, 2 cars, some bikes. They have a sailboat. I never have a sailboat, but they have a couch. They have TVs. They have kitchen table, ironing board. And you look at it and you go, okay, I've seen that. Probably some of you are very close to what this looks like at your house if we put all your possessions outside. Maybe not the same size house, but you would be very similar in what we would look like if we took the typical American family. It would look very, very similar to that. Now, here's some statistics. GDP per capita, here it's only 39,000, but that's quite a while ago. Child mortality, access to modern sanitation. That means everyone has access to indoor plumbing. That's what we mean by modern sanitation. Education and attainment, 60% enroll in higher education. Doesn't mean they all graduate, but 60% have enrolled. Typical family. Now let's go to Mexico. Okay. You look at it, smaller kind of living accommodations. They have one couch. They have a TV, which they seem very attached to. More children. Very typical as we move down the income levels, we will see bigger and bigger families. So here you have 4 children. You see some furnishings in the house. No car. You see some bikes, but a little not as good as the United Kingdom, but we're moving down some. GDP per capita is nearly half, so they don't half the, we should expect about half the living arrangements. A little higher in child mortality. In Mexico, only 85% of the people have access to indoor plumbing, we'll call it. Education attainment is slightly lower. And then finally, this is a picture from Mali, a very, very poor country. And very, very typical of a poor country. If you notice, there's 6 or 7 children. Usually they live in a multi-generational house. The grandparents, the parents, children. You look at their living arrangements. Not uncommon to have dirt floors, kind of adobe-like walls. You look very little modern appliances. Almost all of it is clay pots, wooden spoons. They have a bike. Kind of sad. Well, if you look at their GDP per capita, it tells you that story. Their GDP per capita is 1,500. Child mortality is almost 12%. And then access to modern sanitation facilities is 25%. So this family here doesn't look like it has indoor plumbing. Kind of hard for us to understand that life. Education and attainment, of course, is as low. When I talk to students, it's hard for us to almost conceptualize that people live like that. That is not how even the poor in the United States live. Maybe the homeless live very, very close to that. We have people who live even here in the United States, who are homeless that live on the rivers. But that isn't the average U.S. household. This is the average household in Mali. So it's kind of to wrap our head around where we were born and where other people are born, and sometimes the situation surrounding that. So here it is, without using pictures. Here's just GDP per capita. You can kind of look at it. So what it does is it starts at the beginning of the period, so right around 1900, and then it goes to the end of the period, and it gives you their growth rate, the annual growth rate. What you should notice is that in Argentina, if you go back 100 years, Argentina was a rich country. They were at the top. They were considered a rich country. If you talk about them today, not so rich. They would call a middle income country. You look at like the United Kingdom was at the top of the world at 5,000, almost better than anywhere else. However, today they have significantly shrunk. Place like Japan, really, really poor in 1890. Today, they're equivalent to the United Kingdom. They caught up. If I had exactly the numbers from 1900, Mexico and Japan would have been about the same. However, Japan has doubled Mexico. So we look at these numbers and we see that even just small growth rate changes, 1% difference, can make a huge difference in how fast you grow or don't grow. For the United States, when we talk about growth rates for the US, we usually talk that the US growth rate is right around 2% a year. Here it's 1.8, depends on what year we pick. When we talk about the US growth rate, we usually focus on about 2% a year. So we notice huge differences in standard of living. Of course, we refer to it as great variation in growth rates. You'll say, oh, it's only 1%. Only 1% is a huge difference in our growth rate. Only 1% makes a huge impact. So because of differences in growth rate, ranking of countries have changed substantially over time. Poor countries are not Asian. Sometimes they're referred to as the Asian tigers. Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, South Korea, and they were all relatively poor right after World War II. But due to changes in their economy, they're actually quite rich now. So if you think about Singapore, and if you go back in the history of Singapore, it was a relatively poor country. If you go to Singapore now, that is not what they call that country, is not considered poor. It is considered a very, very rich country. And just because you were rich doesn't mean you stay that way. The United Kingdom used to be the richest place in the world. It is not anymore. Argentina used to be considered a rich country. They are not anymore. And finally, there is something, it's called kind of a rule of thumb. It's called the rule of 70/72. What it does is it tells us how fast it takes something to double based on its growth rate. So if I'm growing at 1% a year, it takes me somewhere between 70 and 72 years to double. If I grow at 2% a year, it's 35 or 36 years to double. If I grow at 3% a year, well, that means I take 72 divided by 3, and if I do it in my head, that's 24 years to double. When we get to 4%, we can divide by whatever makes it come out even. Again, it's not an exact science. Okay? It's just going to give us a rule of thumb. It's kind of a quick idea of how long it takes something to double. There is a mathematical formula. You probably worked it in algebra. But I'm not going to require you to work that formula in class. I just want you to be able to quickly think about how fast something takes to double. And remember, the faster it doubles, the more time you get. So if I were to go from 1 to 2%, that means in 70 years, if I was growing at 1%, $1,000 became $2,000. If I was growing at 2%, that means $1,000 became $4,000. It doubles and then doubles again. So it's not just adding 1,000 each time. It's 1,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 4,000. And so just one percentage change in the growth rate makes a huge difference in what's going to happen over our lifetime. And that's why I picked 70 or 72. That's kind of a lifetime. So how fast were we able to grow over our lifetime in a country? I will also look at why countries are richer than others. Why do some grow quickly and others are stuck in a poverty trap? And what policies can we implement to look at long-run living standards and improvements? So the first thing we want to focus on when we talk about standard of living, when we talk about standard of living, what we always want to focus on is productivity. How well off I am depends on how well I can produce goods and services, and then how valued those goods and services are. So if I could produce a plane a day, by magic, somehow I was that productive and I could alone produce one airplane a day, I would be significantly rich because I could sell my airplane for $10 million and then I would sell one a day and I would have $3 billion by the end of the year. If I can produce a pencil a day, well, I can sell my pencil for 25 cents, so I'm not very productive. If I can't produce goods and services that have value, I'm not going to be able to have a very good standard of living. And standard of living is going to depend on productivity. The more productive you are, sometimes they refer to the more valuable you are to your workplace, the more money you'll make. Well, that's true. The more productive you are in life, the better your standard of living will be. So what is my ability to produce goods and service based on each labor input? How much can I produce in an hour? How much can I produce in a day? And so we measure productivity by Y over L. So productivity for a country is GDP per capita. Real GDP divided by the number of people. So that kind of gives us a proxy for the standard of living in a country. So remember, an income is economy's output, and the faster we can grow our output, the more income that will be available for citizens of the country. So the more output you have, the more income you'll have in a country. And the more productive you are, the more that income will go to you. So when we find when productivity grows rapidly, so do living standards. So what makes up productivity? So if you leave this class, you should at least know the 4 determinants of productivity. And there are 4 of them. I usually drop the per worker, but remember everything here is per capita, per worker. It's just more terms to add every time. So we just usually talk about physical capital. So assuming the population remains the same and I get more physical capital, I will have more productivity. I will have more economic growth. But what do I mean by physical capital? Physical capital, we go back to the chapter 2 definition. Stuff that we use to make other stuff. So physical capital, remember it's going to be physical, stuff we can touch. Okay, the fancy definition of it is the stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. It's the stuff. So if we were talking about producing a class, now that we're online, it's slightly different, but it would be the camera that I have, the computer that I have, the software we use to deliver the material to you, the ability of the servers here at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith to be running. So the more physical capital we have, the better the class, the more easy the class is to deliver. And the more easier it is to deliver, the more students we can deliver it to. So when we talk about physical capital, we talk about the stuff. That's the things that allow us to produce goods and services. So every industry will have its own physical capital of what they use to produce other goods and services. Sometimes it's the building. It would be the building here at UAFS as well. That's what we need to produce goods and services. Second determinant, human capital. That's the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. So that's what I know. So I always ask students, well, why are you going to college? Well, I'm going to college because I want to make more money. Well, how does going to college translate to make more money? Well, you go to college to gain knowledge and skills. So you come here to increase your human capital. And if we do a good job of increasing your human capital, then when you leave this university, you're more productive. And if you're more productive, you're more valuable to an employer, and an employer is more likely to hire you because you're more productive. You can bring better products, more products for them to sell. So you can make more money as well as the company. Remember, it's a trade. And so they're looking to make that trade, and we're looking to increase human capital. And again, it always matters. The amount of human capital in a country per worker tells us how well we're doing. So remember, human capital is knowledge that's already available. So if you think about human capital, it's everything in the book. It's everything in the slides. It's everything that's already been discovered. And the way you learn it is through education, through training. Some of it you'll learn through experience. And that's also part of human capital. So why do people who've worked in a job typically get paid more than people who are brand new? Well, they have more human capital. They have more experience. The more experience you have, the more productive you are. You understand how to get things done easier. So you're more valuable to the company. Third determinant for productivity. This is natural resources. This is inputs into production that nature provides. This is things like land, rivers, mineral deposits, gas, solar, wind, anything that comes from the earth that we use to produce goods and services. Natural resources per worker, if I have more, the better off we're likely to be. Fourth determinant, something called technological knowledge. If you say it real fast, it sounds like technology, and that's kind of what it is. Okay, so as an economist, when we say something is technology or technical knowledge, what do we mean? What we mean is we're talking about society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. This is coming up with new ideas to produce goods and services to make my product stand out. This is a lot of what entrepreneurs do. Is they go, the way you're doing it, that's just not right. There's a better way to do it. And what I do is I go and I find the better way to do it. And I make a new car. I make a car that goes slightly faster with better gas mileage. I make a bigger TV with a better picture as I find ways to improve goods and services. So I go out and I discover new ways. So when we think about technological knowledge, it's kind of not human capital. Human capital is learning what is available. Okay, so human capital is learning about gravity and air resistance that's already known. Technological knowledge is creating an airplane that'll go faster than everybody else's. They're finding better ways or the best ways to produce goods and services. So it's any advance in knowledge that produces productivity and allows society to get more from its resources. And one of the examples that I talk about is Henry Ford. Henry Ford didn't discover the assembly line. Now, if you read some books, you'd think he did. He didn't actually discover the assembly line. He just discovered a way to make it work better. When we get to chapter 15, we'll talk about what Henry Ford did to make the assembly line work better. How do I create opportunities to better the use of natural resources, human capital, and physical capital? So as I said, there's a difference between technical knowledge and human capital. It's important for you to understand that. As a technical knowledge is I'm trying to improve production. And I'm trying to improve the way we use human capital, physical capital, natural resources. Well, human capital is what I know, is what I use to acquire the knowledge we already know. I talk about this because as students, or some of you are parents, you start to get children who go through education. And some of the things I hear is, well, when I was in, pick your grade, I didn't need to know that. And you're right, you didn't need to know that. Because if you think about the knowledge when you went to school was smaller. As we have grown and as we have gotten better at technological knowledge, that builds upon human capital. And then technical knowledge becomes known, and then it's now human capital. So the pile of things that we have to know to become more successful has grown over time. and time hasn't shrunk. So there's more and more things that we have discovered and learned that we need to start to get to before we can get technological knowledge. I can't design a better airplane if I don't know everything that we know already about airplane design. And that expands every day. So as we talk about and as we think about our own children going to school, they're going to have to learn more than we did. Why? Because we've continued to learn over time, but they want to join the workforce where we're at. Well, we already know all of these things because over time we've accumulated them. They can't come in not knowing everything and have everyone teach them. So it becomes more difficult as we push back. And so hence, both will be important for productivity. And those grow. Human capital has grown over time significantly. This is probably one of the more difficult things students don't quite get. And it's kind of weird because it doesn't feel right, because it goes against what you've been told in the news and a lot of different things. And so here's how natural resources play out. And are natural resources a limit to growth? Do we need them? So as we become more and more people in this world, there's this argument that's been around for hundreds of years. As we grow and more people, what we're going to do is we're going to deplete Earth's non-renewable resources. And because we deplete this, we're going to be poorer in the future. However, what we have found is that as we have grown more and more people, we have found ways to avoid this. We become better at using the resources that we have. For example, if you look at gas mileage, we've created hybrid cars. We're going to create electric cars. They're just going to use less gas. So over time, we're not going to run out of oil. We're just going to find different resources to use. We've gotten better insulation at the house. We've changed what we do. And as long as we allow a market economy to work, what happens is scarcity takes care of things. So if a good we start to use up too much, so if we go back to supply and demand, if all of a sudden we cut the supply of oil, what will happen to the price? Well, the price will skyrocket. If the price of oil and gasoline goes up, well, what are we going to do about transportation? Well, as it becomes more expensive for me to buy a gasoline-powered car, well, what I'll do is I'll find another opportunity to buy something that isn't gasoline-powered. So I might go buy a hydrogen-powered car. I might go buy an electric car. I might go buy, I don't know, a wind car. I don't know if those exist. But as prices go up and things become more scarce, what happens is, as society, we determine new ways to produce goods and services. Back to technological knowledge. We find new ways to produce goods. And so what actually happens over time to the price of natural resources? So remember, we're going to take into account the effects of inflation. So if we looked at the price of natural resource goods, pick any good you want, and you can go out 20 years now in the future, and if you adjust for inflation, what will happen to that natural resource? So if we take oil 20 years from now, what will the price of oil be? Well, it'll be higher due to inflation. But what's the real price of oil 20 years from now? Almost any time we do this as economists, we find that the real price is either the same or it has fallen over time. Pick your good. There used to be a group of economists that were referred to as cornucopians. You can go and look them up. And what cornucopians did is they took advantage of, sometimes they were called peakers. They believed that there was things like peak oil. They were sometimes referred to as Malthusians. And what cornucopians would do is they would bet Malthusians that the price of any resource they picked in 20 years from now would be lower. That doesn't fit the discussion that we're growing more in population, we're going to use more natural resources, going to make them more scarce, supply decreases, prices should go up. They might in short term, but in the long term, prices of natural resources are stable or falling. And this is because our ability to conserve resources has always grown more rapidly than the dwindling supplies. I know that's something most students don't always believe, but you can go and you can look at it. It's not something I made up. There is this huge implication of natural resources. Read in the book. It's a very interesting little side note for you to read and discuss and think about how natural resources have not even limited growth. Think about countries such as Japan. They have almost no natural resources. Hasn't stopped them from being prosperous. You can think of other countries. There's a lot of countries in Africa that actually have lots of natural resources, but they actually haven't been able to grow. They find that natural resources is the least important. If I had to pick, natural resources would be at the bottom of my list of what do I need to grow, because it's not that important. There's lots of articles and discussions about, sometimes it's referred to as the curse, that actually having too much natural resources can be a curse rather than a blessing. And if you want to go and read, you can. It's something called the Dutch disease. So we kind of have set out, what do I need to grow? Okay, I have this productivity. I know productivity is going to depend on physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. So I know what we're going to need to be more productive. And I know that the more physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge we can develop as a country, going to increase productivity. When I increase productivity, I'm going to increase standard of living. It's how we get better standard of living in a country, as we become more productive. No matter what politicians tell you, that's how we become better off. And so what government policies do we need to enact to try to raise productivity and living standards? So what can we do to increase living standards? So we're going to talk about one today, because that's probably about all I have time for. And then on next week on Monday, we'll finish up this chapter, and we'll finish discussing some of the other public policy measures we can take. So the first one we're going to talk about. So I kind of put the policy measure up here on top, and I kind of put what variable is most impacted on the bottom. So we're going to talk about savings and investment, and that's mostly going to drive physical capital. So that's kind of how these slides are developed. As they're developed with the policy on top and kind of the determinant of productivity on bottom. So students come to me and say, Dr. Walsh, how do I be rich? How do I become rich in the future? And the simplest answer to that is it's easy to become rich. Doesn't mean everyone can do it. But if I want to be rich in the future, how do I do that? Is I have to save today. That means I have to save money. And I know there's always some excuse, but I want to buy fill in the blank, or I need to buy fill in the blank. I want to buy fill in the blank. We all want to buy more goods and services. And that's fine. But we have to understand that there's a trade-off. If I want to be wealthy and rich in the future, the only way that occurs is if I save money. And the same thing works for the government. If a government can save money, and we'll talk about this in the next chapter, the more money the government saves, the more opportunity they have for investment. And if you remember from chapter 10, pretty much investment is the buying of physical capital. So the more I save, the more savings I have for investment. The more investment businesses make in physical capital creates more goods in the future. But again, this always comes with a trade-off. If I want to produce more capital, I have to give fewer consumption goods. So in order to be rich in the futures, I have to sacrifice buying something today. And I do that because I believe in the future I will be better off. And that's hard. It's hard for individuals, it's hard for governments, it's hard for companies, it's hard for lots of people to do that. But for the most part, if you want to be wealthy in this world, save your money. Find ways to save. They talk about in personal finance, they talk about all these different ways you can save money. We're not going to focus a lot about that here. But just understand that the more money I can save, the richer I can become in the future. Same thing works for governments. So we're going to look then for policies that allow us to grow in the future. So as physical capital increases, so does productivity and living standards. However, this faster growth will only be temporary. And why that is that there's something called diminishing returns to capital. So as we get more and more physical capital, the extra output from an additional unit of physical capital falls. So the way I like to focus this is, let's say we were starting with a country with no power plants. So we had no ability to create electricity. We had everything else, but no power plants. So the first power plant we build will give electricity to most people. And the people then can use this electricity to build more goods and services. So that first power plant creates huge growth in the economy. Now, if we add a second power plant, as we add more capital, we get more productivity. It's just not as big a bang as the first one. And then as we add a third one, we get a little bit more. The fourth one, a slight bit more. The fifth one, barely more. So as we keep increasing physical capital, it does increase productivity and living standards. It's just the change is smaller. The growth will be smaller as we keep increasing capital. And this is referred to as diminishing returns to capital. There's also things called constant returns to capital, which means that each unit of capital gives us the exact same in output. So if I double capital, that means I would double output. You could be at increasing returns to capital. That means if I doubled capital, I would get more than double my output. But where we are in the United States is we're always on diminishing returns to capital. So that means if I double capital, I get more output. I just don't get double the output. I get less than double. So here's kind of what a picture would look like. So if we have little capital per worker, right? So we always, everything remember is per capita or per worker. So if we start here at the very beginning of the slide, we notice we don't have very much capital per worker. Boom, all of a sudden we get some more capital. And what we notice is this big jump in output, shooting up. However, as we move farther and farther down our production function, as we get near the end here, we get the same change in capital. However, because we're farther down the line, we don't get nearly the output increase. So there's this diminishing returns. And we notice this diminishing returns in something referred to as the catch-up effect. And the catch-up effect is a property whereby countries that start off poor grow more rapidly than countries that start off rich. So if you look at the United States, we grow at 2% a year. That's a good number for us. If you look at China, they grow at 6% a year. And that's a good number for them. South Korea, from the 60s to the 90s, grew over 6% a year. Well, because they were really poor in the 60s. And it was easy for them to grow. All they had to do was get a little bit of capital and boom, they could explode. And they did. Why? Their GDP per capita was small. With small GDP per capita, it's easy to get more bang for your buck. And while in the United States, we're way over there on the right tail, right? We're way over here on the right tail. It's hard for us to get changes in capital to really move our GDP per capita. We need to, but it's just harder for us to do. Sometimes I talk about it with students. I said if you got a very poor grade on your first test, so you got a 50%, in order for you to go to 50 to 70 is a whole lot easier for someone to go from 80 to 100. For you to go from 50 to 70, you probably have to put in a couple more hours of work. From a student to go from 80 to 100, they're probably going to have to put in 10 or 12 more hours of work. And so what happens is as you have a poor grade, it's easier to improve your grade than if you have a richer grade. And man, it might be really hard to move from a 90 to a 94. In order for you to do that, you'd have to put in 10 hours more work. And it might not be worth your time for that little bit of influence. However, to move from a 50 to a 70, maybe it's 3 extra hours of work. And so you get more bang for your buck or your time if you are poorer, just like countries. So if you're poorer in GDP per capita, it's easier for them to grow than if you're richer in GDP per capita. The U.S. is on the richer side of GDP per capita. It's harder for us to grow. Doesn't mean we can't. It's just slightly harder for us to do it. And so the catch-up effect works very simple, just like we talked about before. Poor country, rich country. It's the exact same graph. I just changed the terms. All right, are there any questions about today's lecture? All right, there's no discussion about today's lecture.